This is The Blockchain Show. The Blockchain Show is a podcast that demystifies and promotes widespread adoption of cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology. You're listening to episode number 87 with Adam Koltun from Quantum Resistant Ledger.
Hello, and welcome to The Blockchain Show, and thank you for downloading another episode. And we have a very interesting episode for you. But first, lots happening in the news, and I've been scouring the news this week, and it does seem like more and more people are saying that blockchain is the answer to the future of business, which is quite interesting. The Financial Times and a few other publications have done a few things around this. So while it's all doom and gloom around politics, for the blockchain and what it means to business, it's on the up. So today we have our friend Adam, and Adam is going to introduce himself and give us the elevator pitch for what he's doing with the blockchain and how it's going to change our lives. Adam?
Hi, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I'm Adam Koltun. I am the lead business strategist for the Quantum Resistant Ledger. In a nutshell, what we are is what it says on the tin. We are building a quantum-resistant blockchain, so a blockchain that's resistant to traditional and quantum computers. Bare bones pitch, blockchain is a forward-looking technology, and so we believe it should look forward. So quantum computers are the next iteration of this centuries-old struggle between cryptographers and code breakers. Security is not static. It changes, maybe not every day, but it changes every generation, every few years sometimes. And, you can go back in more recent history to, some certain high profile examples, like in World War II, where, you had code makers and code breakers on opposite sides fighting it out. And the compromisation of certain codes was decisive in that war. Today, computers dominate both code making and code breaking by and large. And our current cryptography is based on the assumptions of those systems. Quantum computers work entirely differently than traditional computers. So the assumptions we've made security-wise about traditional computers no longer apply in the same way. And to that end, you need to have sort of very different structures to make yourself resistant to this new computational threat that is growing.
First of all, for the people listening in their Aston Martins eating pizza, probably, What is quantum computing? Is my new laptop a quantum computer? Can you just explain this new element of computing, first of all, so that we can make sure everybody's on the same page before we talk about the security of it?
Sure. No, that makes total sense. You have to have a baseline understanding of something before you can get into the weeds, as it were. Okay, so quantum computers are best understood as they relate and don't relate to traditional computers, which we're all familiar with. So traditional computers, as most people are aware, are binary systems. They work on ones and zeros. A byte can be a 1 or a 0, and that's the atomic sort of unit of a traditional computer. This means that, when you add more chips onto a board, when you make more advanced traditional computers, it's mostly about scale. It's about fitting more computational elements onto the same space, being able to do more in a smaller space. It's where we get, things like Moore's law and other common understandings of traditional computers. Back in the 1960s, a computer took up an entire room and, could only do a few tricks. Today, computers fit in our pockets and can do quite a bit. Right now, quantum computers are best thought of like the computers of the 1960s. They take up an entire room and they only do a few tricks right now. But as with traditional computers, the technology is evolving. Will we one day hold quantum computers in our hands like a cell phone? I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that quantum computers, like traditional computers, are going to be vastly more useful with each iterative generation of the technology. So a quantum computer is not a binary system. As opposed to being just 1 or just 0, a quantum computer has more states. A qubit, which is what they're called, has can be in what's called a superposition of both 0 and 1 at the same time. And that, understandably, can sometimes be a little headache-inducing, how something can be two different things at the same time. And to be perfectly blunt, understanding that sort of level of quantum physics isn't really important. What is important is understanding how the two technologies scale. So, for example, a traditional computer scales multiplicatively. That means when you put twice as many chips or twice as many bits or bytes together, you get twice as much computational power. It's very linear in that sense and easy to understand. Quantum computers are a bit more tricky. They're a bit less intuitive. A quantum computer works exponentially. So what that means is that if you have, say, only two, just two little qubits together, they can do 4 positions. If you add one more qubit to that system and now have 3, they can do 8 positions. At 4, you can do 16. It very, very rapidly and almost parabolically scales up. And what this creates is a situation where quantum computing can vastly increase its computational power year over year without needing, like a traditional computer, to fit twice as many bits into the same space in a Moore's law type sort of situation. So it's a technology that develops in a non-linear fashion. And when things develop in a non-linear fashion, it's hard to predict exactly when they are going to be operational. And that's why I think, bringing it back to security, it's one of the reasons why security is so important in this space, because we can't very specifically articulate exactly when the threat is going to arrive. So it makes sense to be prepared, be proactive rather than reactive.
That makes sense. But basically what you're saying is the more you scale it out, the more power you get exponentially. So the amount of quantum processing sprawl, shall we say, that will occur when people start using this more and more, it's going to be rapid.
Yes. Now, admittedly, there are, certain technological limitations right now that people in developing this technology are working through, which is why quantum computers, haven't replaced supercomputers, for example, at certain levels of research. But the technology is such that sometimes if you just look at the headlines, you don't always grasp the full impact of what's happening. You hear, researchers at, IBM and Google and stuff have gone from, having a 50 qubit system to a 70 qubit system. Well, intuitively, you'd think, oh, well, that's a little bit less than half improvement. When really, when they went from 50 to 51, that was twice as much. When they went from 51 to 52, they doubled it again. And so, 20 iterations of that is actually quite a bit of a jump. But on the surface, given how we've all been trained to think about computers, it just doesn't seem as impressive. So part of, I think, understanding quantum computers is just understanding the peculiarities of the technology, like with anything.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. We're all on a level playing field here, and we understand that this obviously will be the future, and it's certainly an up-and-coming technology. So where do you fit into this?
Right. So quantum computers have implications for all network technologies. They have implications for Gmail. They have implications for, just normal internet traffic, and they have implications for blockchains. However, centralized and decentralized systems work very differently. One of the things we all love about blockchain is that it's not a centralized system. To just use a very sort of broad example, I have a Bitcoin wallet. I'm sure many people that listen to this show do. I know my private key, and hopefully for my wallet's balance, nobody else knows my private key, not even the people that run the nodes and verify the transactions. There's no God administrator in a decentralized system. And that's wonderful for personal empowerment, for giving me control over my funds. What it's not so great for is network-wide moves, network-wide upgrades, because there's no way to force an entire network to do a thing when you don't have absolute control over it. If Google, which I use for my personal email, if Gmail wants to upgrade their security backend overnight, they don't need my consent. They don't need to notify me. They already know all the information they need to, and they can do it unilaterally. If Bitcoin or Ethereum or any blockchain that exists, just using those two examples because they're the most common, wants to upgrade something across the entire network, it may be able to do it unilaterally, like certain things that can be done via a fork. However, certain things that involve someone's private key, which the network doesn't already know, can't be unilaterally forked away in that way. So it creates a very, very thorny problem of how do we upgrade the security in this space for existing legacy blockchains. And I'll be perfectly honest, at QRL, we don't have the specific answer to that because luckily we have the privilege of not being a first generation blockchain, so we get to do it right from the beginning. A metaphor I like to use, because I grew up sort of on a lake sailing a lot, is that it's a lot easier to waterproof a boat while it's out of the water. Once you're in the middle of everything and trying to make changes in real time, it's still possible, but it adds many layers of complication to it.
Absolutely, totally agree with you on that one.
Yeah, and so obviously we were inspired by the initial sort of big players in this space. Our founders, who are both English, have spent years being interested in and participating in the open source Bitcoin community. In fact, the initial idea, the sort of the genus of why QRL even exists was our founder Peter Waterland trying to think of a way to make Bitcoin quantum resistant, because Bitcoin uses elliptic curve cryptography, which can be vulnerable to a sufficiently powerful quantum computer running Shor's algorithm. Unfortunately, he came up with this idea in the fall of 2016, which, as we all recall, was sort of when a lot of the block scaling and other political debates began to sort of dominate discourse within the Bitcoin community. People were much more interested in worrying about those sort of short-term economic realities than some of the long-term technological concerns. And so, like many people that are driven and passionate, when he sort of ran into a wall of disinterest bordering on apathy for his idea, that's when Peter wrote the white paper and decided to start his own project to sort of demonstrate both the possibility as well as the utility and ultimately the necessity of what we're trying to accomplish in the security space.
If there is such a thing as a threat of quantum computing to blockchain security, would it be that the quantum computers could theoretically crack any code or any encryption key on the current blockchain as we know it?
So the current blockchains that we know, certainly Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all derivatives and forks of those two chains, as well as most others, use a cryptography that's known as ECDSA, which stands for Elliptic Curve Distributed Signature Algorithm. It is what creates the mathematical relationship between your public key and your private key. And it is predicated on one very simple assumption. Generally speaking, in security, every assumption you make is a failure point. So you want to have as few assumptions as possible, typically only one or maybe one or two. ECDSA has only one single security assumption, which is very good. However, that security assumption is that computers are simply unable to factorize very, very large numbers in human amounts of time. If you took a supercomputer, it would take thousands upon thousands of years to crack a Bitcoin private key. Let me phrase that accurately. To derive a Bitcoin private key from a Bitcoin public key would take thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But there is a mathematical relationship there. There is an algorithm known as Shor's algorithm that's been around for a couple decades now, and it cannot be run on computers because of its structure and computers not being very good at what it is asking of them. However, a sufficiently powerful quantum computer will be able to run Shor's algorithm. So that's how we know mathematically where sort of the first attack from quantum computing could be for the blockchain space. Now, there's a reason we call ourselves the quantum resistant ledger and not the quantum proof ledger. For the same reason you should never buy a waterproof watch. It's not really technically accurate. We know that we have sort of mathematical solutions for the mathematical problems that quantum computers are going to bring to bear in this space initially. However, it would be nothing short of hubris to declare unilaterally that we or anyone knows the complete technological possibility of quantum computers from now until the heat death of the universe. Like that, that's irrational. But what we do know is sort of where the sort of first salvo from that technological direction is going to come towards blockchain, and a decided vulnerability in the current structure of most blockchains, namely the signature scheme, because ECDSA's underlying security assumption is just upended by the existence of sufficiently powerful quantum computers.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that is very, on the one hand, and at a granular level, and certainly if you talk to our post-quantum cryptographer, Leon, it is a very complicated thing. It is something that requires a very astute and subtle understanding of a lot of different scientific concepts as well as mathematics. But in general, I think the story of it all is pretty easy to understand. We have a security system that's based on some assumptions, and those assumptions are sort of out of date. And the new technology that is upending those assumptions obviously has security implications for the old guard, if you will. I think that's an understanding and a narrative that most people can get behind, even if they might not understand quantum computing at a granular level or something like that. That's how I try to phrase it to non-technical audiences when I'm speaking, because full disclosure, and I don't make any secret of this, I don't have a technical background myself. My degrees are in the social sciences, so I always try to put myself in that headspace when talking to a more generalized audience.
So effectively, what we're saying here is that our understanding and security around blockchain and also encryption is based on that one assumption that it is going to take you a enormous amount of time to actually crack it. But as processing gets stronger and faster, then that assumption gets reduced over a period of time as the power of processing goes up.
Yes, because the assumption was based on the fact that, so traditional computers could become hugely powerful and they still wouldn't be able to crack ECDSA just because of how they're structured. It's kind of like no matter how sharp a blade, you're never going to cut through a mountain with it. It's just not what the tool is designed for.
Yep.
What upends that security assumption is that there's an entirely new type of technology, and that new type of technology is scaling. So yes, it ultimately does come down to processing power. Any discussion about computing does. I just wanted to make clear that it's not traditional computing processing power as we're normally used to thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, this is a thing that has implications across the just network technologies, blockchain and otherwise, because blockchain ultimately, while it has invented a lot of new things, like all technology, it's taken a lot of lessons from other and pieces of other technology to build itself. It uses the internet. That's an already existing technology. Its encryption system was based on encryption systems that are common to the internet, which is, a public key, private key pairing system. And certainly, and this is a very important point, I think, in sort of understanding the timeline of this all, when Bitcoin was started in 2008, quantum computers are still thought of as like an if question. Like, is it possible that quantum computers will even exist? The largest quantum computer was only 1 or 2 qubits large. They broke constantly. It was hard to get them stable. And it was still sort of like a theoretical proposition. Quantum computers are no longer in the if category. Quantum computers have been firmly put in the when category now. And the conversation now is no longer, is this possible, but more, when will this be cracked? When will somebody meet this next milestone? And when you have that sort of tectonic shift in regards to a technology, that's when you need to start taking it seriously. And that didn't happen really until like the early 2010s. So, it wasn't any sort of oversight or hubris or anything like that when these initial blockchains were starting up that they based themselves on ECDSA. That was the gospel at the time. That was the accepted truth. But as everyone, knows, that's sort of the beauty and the terror of technology. It takes things you never thought were possible and makes them possible, both in good and bad ways. We've reached levels of, medical advancement as well as, sadly, advanced in weapons technology where we can save and harm more people in larger number than at any other time in human history. And security in many ways kind of works the same way. We can, in many ways, keep more things secure than ever before. But in other ways, we are less secure and less private and more exposed than at any other time in human history. It's just a raising of the stakes as sort of is our species bent.
Absolutely, and I remember working for a bank once and dealing with a remote access system, and they were very worried about increasing their surface area on the internet, but they had to weigh that against the increased usability with users being able to work remotely on all of their systems. So, yeah. As we grow and as this technology grows, then of course we have more surface area to be attacked. So how does your quantum resistance work? How does it manifest itself? I'm trying to visualize this.
Yeah, no, great question. So as I was saying before, 2 main things with security. One is the assumption, and the other thing is, kind of what that assumption is based off of, or the vulnerability inherent in any assumption. So as we said, ECDSA is very large numbers, cannot be factorized in human amounts of time. What we use is not a factor-based cryptography. So we don't do something that's going to make a quantum computer unable to factorize the public keys on our network. We have private keys that are not related mathematically to those public keys via factorization. So when I'm feeling cheeky, what I like to say is that a quantum computer will be able to factor your public key on QRL, but it's not going to give you a number that's useful. It's a situation where we've combined two established mathematical elements, one known as the Winternitz one-time signatures, and the other one known as the extended Merkle signature scheme. These are fairly well established. The extended Merkle signature scheme can sort of trace its roots back to the late 1970s, early 1980s in mathematics. Because the beauty of math is that you can, once you've demonstrated that things are theoretically possible, you can then play with that theory before the actual physical technology to manifest it exists. And so quantum computers are being, discussed in mathematics in the 1980s, as well as, how would one deal with it eventually? And so instead of having your one public key, one private key relationship, we have a one public key, many private key relationship. And many is somewhat of an understatement. I'm talking like thousands and thousands of keys. And what that does is it creates a situation where when a key is used once, it cannot be used again. And you then move along the index to the next key. And this creates a situation where from the outside looking in, if someone was to try to figure out what key you're about to use or even what your keys are, that would be extremely difficult because of hashes. And hashes, to make sort of a long mathematical story short, are basically one-way functions. You can kind of think about it like baking. If you wanted to bake a cake, you'd have, eggs and milk and sugar and flour. And if you put them all together and you cook the cake and then you give it to somebody and say, okay, now separate the parts. I want you to put the eggs back together, put the milk back together, take the flour from the sugar and separate. You wouldn't be able to, because they've been transformed in that way. And hashes are very similar, especially when you combine them with variable elements. So to make a long story short, we sidestep the factorization issue entirely. And sometimes it's good to build a bridge over a large chasm, and sometimes it's best just to walk around. And we've sort of walked around in that sense. The extended Merkle signature scheme is a situation where, it provides a back end of security that is just in a different category than elliptic curve cryptography, because cryptography is a pretty broad field. I mean, even post quantum cryptography, which is in many ways somewhat new, there's sort of 5 main variations, only one of which we're using, the hash based cryptography. I would not be surprised if there were other projects in the coming months and years that did try to bring some of these other types of post quantum cryptography into the blockchain space. Now, personally, we believe that the type we used is the most natural fit for the technological needs of blockchain. But, the beauty of technology is that you can try to solve the same problem in so many different ways. And hopefully those projects with the most merit are the ones that are left standing.
Let's hope so. So does this mean that the current blockchain models we're using at the moment will be obsolete?
Well, yes and no. I mean, quantum resistance right now, I suppose, could be viewed as a luxury. Eventually, it will be a necessity. Eventually, all projects will either exist and be quantum resistant, or they won't. With that being said, I don't think that blockchain will become obsolete at all, in the sense that, even on our chain, and we have a very different signature scheme from other people's signature schemes, but the user experience is nearly identical. When you log into your QRL wallet, we're not asking people to write down 10,000 or 100,000 keys on a piece of paper somewhere and type one in and then cross it off. And no, that would be ridiculous. You have a mnemonic or a hex seed. Many people are favoring the mnemonic, which is, that string of words that you use as a password. And that's what gets you into your wallet. However, when the wallet itself interacts with the blockchain, that's where all this sort of index of keys end up getting used. And that's the beauty of technology, right? Things can look the same and work the same from a user to interface point of view. But then the interface to the back end can be completely different, more effective, more secure, more efficient.
That sounds pretty good to me. And it's interesting that your business model is based upon something that's going to happen in the future, as opposed to something that's happening in the very near future. It's actually somewhere distant in the future, but it is something that's going to happen. And it's going to be interesting when we do get to that point. And it sounds like you're going to be very well prepared for that element when you do have to increase the security element. Where is this all going to end, do you think? If we're adding more and more security and more preemptive security, surely we get to the point where we've got so much security, suddenly the usefulness of it disappears.
It certainly might seem that way at times, and that's understandable. I mean, to be fair, it seemed that way at times in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, except about the very type of cryptography that is now becoming vulnerable. The long history of encryption and code breaking is such where it tends to swing. The pendulum doesn't always swing back evenly, but there are times when sort of to make broad categorizations, defensive technology is more advanced. And then there are times when sort of offensive or penetrative technology is more advanced. And I think with quantum computing, we may see some fairly quick swings in that regard, just because it is a nonlinear technology. One of the things about quantum computing that makes it, sometimes I feel like I'm talking about global warming, if we're being honest, in the way that it's like, it's not a problem that it's going to be an issue tomorrow, but at the same time, in order to properly deal with it and make sure it's not a catastrophe in a couple of years, we kind of need to start dealing with it tomorrow. And ironically, I get a lot of the same pushback that people do when talking about global warming, where I'll get people that will sort of concede that it's an issue and then immediately dismiss it as, well, my children will have to worry about that, or my grandchildren will have to worry about that, but I don't. Yeah. Or they're convinced it's an issue, but like global warming, they'll sort of take the cop out of being like, well, this is an issue, but I'm sure by the time it could actually harm anything or threaten anyone, the powers that be will have fixed it all for us. And while I do sort of admire the faith in public institutions that point of view espouses, I think, if personally speaking as a student of history, that is not always how things have panned out. Sometimes, sadly, people see the writing on the wall and ignore it anyway, and then negative repercussions or outcomes occur. And so what we're trying to do is just be as secure and as forward looking as possible, because ultimately blockchain is a technology about the future, in my opinion, at least. And yes, when you start stacking sandbags on the side of the road when it's completely dry out, people do sometimes look at you funny. We're basically betting on the fact that when the floodwaters do show up, it's going to be pretty cool to be dry, and those sandbags will have been borne out to have been a good investment.
Yeah. So basically, for you listening at home, your boat hasn't got a hole in it at the moment, but the next time you take it out of the water, look for any potential holes or potential areas which might have holes in the future.
Yeah, or perhaps to put it similarly, the acidity level of water is rising, and the current wax we're using for our boats is not going to last forever. But yeah,
there we go. Okay.
Nautical nonsense aside, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a situation where, you know, quantum resistance it's in our name. It is our main value proposition, but we are also a open source network. We're trying to build a platform that is appealing to developers and secondary application developers, because it's all, in my opinion, it's all related to security. If you're trying to build a house, you want to have as secure a foundation as possible. If you're going to commit months or a year or 2 years or whatever of your life to building an application, you probably want the network it's on to be secure 3, 5, 7 years down the road, or else you're going to have to tear everything down and move your app and build it all over again when the rickety foundation comes down. So I personally think that there's always a value in forward-looking security, because the future is going to come whether we want to or not. And anyone that's hoping to be around and be successful in that new future is served well by looking to it now, as opposed to when it's sort of forced upon you.
Absolutely. Forewarned is forearmed. So how do our listeners get in touch? How do they find out more, and what should they be doing?
Well, if you want to find out more, our website is theqrl.org. There you have links to our white paper, to our block explorer, to our social media hubs. Our main hub is Discord. We also have a subreddit and a Twitter and a Medium. We put all of our information out there. Our developers right now are sort of quite busy ensuring the security of our network. We launched yesterday. So they're all very busy with that. But in general, they're actually fairly interactive with the community. And certainly anyone that wants to build an application on our network or otherwise integrate with our network, we're very open to that and we'll help you along in that journey if you want to go on it with us.
Fabulous. That sounds pretty good. And you launched yesterday, so at the moment you're lacking sleep, I imagine, if the launch was yesterday.
Yeah, I'm running on about 72 hours of consciousness against about like 6 hours of sleep.
Okay, sounds about right for any launch in this day and age. And how did you launch? What did you actually do?
So we have had a testnet operational since last year. In around March, we upgraded that to sort of what we were colloquially calling our beta network. And alongside with that test network, we were also represented by an ERC20 on the Ethereum network. Starting in April, we began to move that ERC20 to our main network. And then yesterday at about 3 a.m. local time or something like that, we started our Genesis block. And then when the Genesis block was finished, the blockchain's off to the races. So we are an independent blockchain powered by our own independent cryptocurrency. And, if we're a POW chain, if you're a miner, come check us out. So we are officially no longer a token on somebody else's network and are now fully housed on our own network.
Wow, that's fantastic. And that's something which I know our audience will be very interested in. I know we've got quite a lot of miners out there, as well as people who are looking for the next big thing. So certainly, if you are listening to this now, take a look at the website, find out more, and get involved. That sounds pretty good, Adam. Thank you very much for your time today. Ethan, have you got any questions?
No, I got a lot to learn. You just changed my whole paradigm, Adam. Thank you.
You're welcome. It can seem a little bit imposing at first, but it actually is pretty comprehensible.
Thank you. That means I'm going to add more reading material to my daily reading list to find out how this goes and keep watching this. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners for downloading the podcast and keeping us going. Please keep on sending your feedback in and keep in touch with us. And tell your friends about us, because we need more people to download the show and then we get more traction. So if you could tell your friends, get them to download it, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much again for listening, and we will be publishing a new podcast soon. Thank you.
To learn more, visit theblockchainshow.com.